This is Elliot Haspel, and welcome to another edition of Best Practices Weekly. We're on the road today, so no poster board, but this week's article comes from the Reading Research Quarterly, and it's in which a University of Victoria in Canada professor reviews 2 new books on second language acquisition, which is especially important for English language learners. And a lot more information about what these books are and just more about them can be found in the article download, so I definitely recommend that you download that this week if you don't normally do it. But I'm going to summarize some of the main points. And now this is a long review, there's a lot of information, so I'm just sort of pulling out the most actionable points for teachers. There's definitely more in there, and I do encourage you to go and seek out those books if you want to know more. Now, in the first book, the professor highlights a couple of key findings, and one of them is that while vocabulary instruction continues to be one of the, if not the most critical aspect of second language acquisition, it's also very important that we're teaching students about text structure. And so this means that students need to understand the use of pronouns, they need to understand the connecting words, they need to understand cohesion, how is one idea linked to another idea, in addition to things like what is the genre, what is the author's purpose, that we really help students understand both the structure as well as the meaning of the words. We're going to really help them start to build their comprehension skills. And along with that, it seems that actually grammar instruction is more important than was originally thought when it comes to second language acquisition. But it's not just grammar for grammar's sake, but grammar for very specific purposes. So teaching students grammar of how do you track reference, for example. So how are you telling which words, especially pronouns and things like that, are referring to who or what? How can you look at the grammar and deduce from that the author's position on a particular topic? So very strategic grammar instruction seems to have, again, a significant impact on students' comprehension skills. And the third piece that has definitely been reinforced in this book is that it's really important that second language learners become strategic readers. So what that means is that in addition to being able to just make meaning from a passage, that students are able to go between different comprehension strategies and talk about why they're using them and why it's appropriate in that context with that particular type of text. That seems to be the hallmark of a truly proficient second language learner. And then the second book has, again, a number of ideas because it's a compilation of a bunch of different essays from many different researchers, but I think one of the newest ideas in there is that there is both comprehension when it comes to second language acquisition, and then there is actual acquisition of the language, which is the ability to fully manipulate and understand how a language works and then be able to translate that into oral, written, all sorts of forms. And that's actually separate in some ways from reading comprehension. Just I can take this passage, I can read it, I can understand what it's about, versus I actually get how the language is working here to make that passage come to being. And so what one of the authors in this talks about is that there is the idea of doing both at once with a couple of different kinds of activities, and I'm going to describe those now. One is narrow reading, and so there's not universal agreement about this among the researchers, but narrow reading is when you're reading a series of the same texts about the same topics or the same subjects, and by reading those, you're actually going to be exposing students to very similar linguistic forms over and over again, the idea being that students will start to understand, not only comprehend the material, but they'll also be starting to understand the forms and the structures of the text because they're not focusing quite so much on understanding and making meaning of what is this about, but they're much more being able to use their cognitive energy on understanding how, again, the passages, the text are structured. A second idea along these lines is textual enhancement, and what that means is physically actually making these forms more noticeable through bolding, through underlining, through italicizing. By form might be an idiom or a connecting word, and so the research seems to indicate that this on its own isn't going to help students be able to get the form of language, but it can be one really useful step and one really useful strategy. And a third kind is this idea of processing instruction, and this is a 3-step process in which you provide English language learners or second language learners with the same text, and then you actually instruct them in common pitfalls they might fall into. And what I mean by that is the example they give in the article is many English language learners or second language learners will go and think the very first noun that they come to in a sentence is the subject of that sentence, or the agent of that sentence, the person or thing doing something. That's not always the case, and so if we actually instruct students that this is a common pitfall, we need to be careful of it, and then lead them in activities around different ways of looking at sentences and different ways of finding the subject, then actually helping them in a very metacognitive way think about how they're processing the language, and again helps build their linguistic and acquisitional skills, because they're able to understand why the language works the way it does, in addition to helping them make meaning of the actual sentences and of the actual passages. So again, I encourage you to download the article, take a look at those books if they interest you. Thanks, and happy teaching.